everybody, and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I changed it because Daryl's not here. I'm Taylor Rockwell, and I'm alone in studio today. As I said, Daryl is not here. He is at home and is reportedly licking his wounds following a CONMEBOL draft that was universally accepted as being weaker than mine. So instead, I've called up Pace Soccer's Richard Whittall to talk the 2026 World Cup bid, the state of soccer in Canada, Monchi's move from Sevilla to Roma, and the recent and ongoing upheaval at ESPN. I know those sound like pretty disparate categories, and they are, for sure, but that just shows how much knowledge Richard has. Full disclosure, on that note, he is my editor at Paste. Not sure if that is actually a thing that's worth noting, but it makes me feel reputable to do so, so I did it. Anyway, without further ado, here's my conversation with Richard. Joining me now, I've got Richard Whittall, freelance writer and my editor at Pace Soccer. Richard, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's we've known each other for a while now, but it's the first time you've been on the pod, which is an exciting turn of events, I would say, for me at least.
Yeah, we've had good long phone conversations, so ideally this will go well as well.
Yeah, and hopefully slightly more exciting than discussing like editorial and grammar policy, but who knows?
Hey man, that stuff's really exciting to me, so don't besmirch it.
Fair point. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about Monchi, his move from Sevilla to Roma, mostly because I've been wanting to talk about it with somebody. I saw you tweeted about it on Twitter, and I was like, that's enough for me. I want Richard on the show. But first, you are based in Toronto, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. So I did want to ask you first, before we get going with Monchi, about the 2026 World Cup bid, obviously the joint bid with USA, Mexico, and Canada. What has been the reaction in Canada? Are people excited about this, or is it sort of like, that's a shame that we're not getting that many games?
Sort of strange, actually. There was a lot of kerfuffle when the announcement was made, and I think a lot of people, I don't think they were shocked, but I think they were, when you actually saw the bid on paper, that we were only getting a handful of group stage matches. The truth of the matter became fairly clear, and that this was a way, to we were sort of part of a means to really get the United States to host the tournament again. So, I mean, some disappointment. I mean, I've been pretty public on my own reluctance to host a tournament, just because obviously of, FIFA's tax exemption policies and their relationship with host nations isn't the best, and they don't have the greatest legacy. And obviously, it's a huge amount of spending and for arguably very little return in the long run. So there's a lot of reasons why, in some ways, it's a good thing that we're not having to put a ton of money into infrastructure to host it. So that's a positive. But obviously the negative is it's not the most, outside of obviously Canada getting an automatic berth, I guess, which will happen. I'm not even sure if that's I assume that's going to be part of the deal. But, outside of that, I mean, just getting 10 group stage matches is kind of it's not the biggest showcase of the country that you could get. So I'm sort of split, if that makes sense. But I mean, as far as the media is concerned, yeah, it seemed to be. There was a spike, and then it sort of disappeared. So I don't think it's really on anyone's radar yet. So
going back to one thing you said it seems like it's been used as a means to get the U.S. to host again. What do you think it was that necessitated Canada being involved? Because I think the Mexico inclusion makes a little more sense, both politically and because Mexico haven't hosted in a while, so you kind of don't have that rival bid. Why do you think Canada was included, or what makes you have that sort of sentiment?
Well, I mean, I don't know. People like Canada, I guess. There's an image factor. We have flexible. I mean, we sort of laugh, but I mean, we're viewed as fairly sort of soft politically. Yeah. While Trump was sort of announcing, a border wall with Mexico, we were legalizing marijuana. So I think this is something that kind of internationally takes the edge off of what people are still looking at as a Trump, very much a Trump-led America right now. And that could obviously change ahead of 2026. So it's something to keep in mind. So I think that's definitely part of it. I think there's obviously Victor Montagliani being president of CONCACAF. I don't want to get into, quid pro quo stuff, but I think, there's probably some glad handling that was done that probably led to that arrangement as well. So a number of factors, and I think it's important politically for the United States in terms of our relationship with MLS. There's a lot of I wouldn't say a lot. There's some controversy there about the role of Major League Soccer and player development in Canada. And I think Canada probably lobbied for inclusion on the basis that they're trying to get this Canadian Premier League off the ground as well. So I think there's a number of things that were probably, I think Vic's position kind of made that a little easier. So I'm sure that all came into play. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's for someone to do some investigative reporting on and to talk about later.
Yeah. So I did actually want to ask you about just like Canadian soccer as a whole as well. So yeah, if you don't mind, just in like 30 seconds, just sum up everything. Not really. It's more, I'm just wondering, like, what are your feelings about Canadian soccer now and kind of the expectation that comes with potentially being a host nation in 2026? Because I think a lot of American listeners, our audience is 90% US based, think of Canada as like, our neighbor to the north, but also that team that we play once every January or February. And outside of that, maybe in a Gold Cup occasionally. So I don't think maybe people pay that much attention to Canada or as much as they should for it being our neighbor. So could you give us kind of an insight into the state of Canadian soccer now and what your hopes or expectations are for the future?
Yeah, 30 seconds, eh? Well, I mean, in some ways, we had an opportunity to have a head start over the United States. Obviously, massive differences in infrastructure and size and population, but we did qualify for the '86 World Cup. There was a lot of positivity going into that, and I think they tried for a Canadian Soccer League then, and I guess it was in '86, and it sort of tanked because of the reason they always tank, which is financial issues. I think that was in '92 or '93 it folded. So, and that sort of was like, that kind of cratered the national team program. And we went through a huge number of coaches. The sort of one highlight was winning the Gold Cup in 2000. But it was kind of a fluke event. Sort of not really reflective of how well the program's been doing since. So I think there's a sense that, what was holding back the national team for a long time was we had these provincial soccer associations that sort of used the Canadian Soccer Association as like an umbrella organization. And so that the provinces really used the CSA to meet their own requirements as opposed to trying to stock a competitive national team. So I think that there's a sense that has changed. Obviously, MLS coming has helped that a lot. But I think now there's a real sense that we don't have any developmental infrastructure whatsoever. So I think this push for the Canadian Premier League, if it's done well, will fill in that missing piece a bit. And I think there's a sense of optimism. And we've had things, like we had this League One Ontario, developmental U23 developmental league, which led to people like Kyle Aaron going to Orlando. So I think there's a sense that there's some momentum with that, and that we just have to do the rest of the work. So we're still looking like another decade, another 2 decades to see what the fruits of this work will be. But I think there's a genuine sense of hope for the future.
So which thing do you think happens first? Canada qualify for a World Cup, or Monchi starts having an effect at Roma?
Definitely Monchi at Roma.
Okay.
I think by the time we're competitive in a World Cup, I think Monchi will be departed, and maybe I will be as well. So definitely Monchi. Yeah.
So
good segue, though.
Thank you. I try. Yeah. So let's talk about him for a second. And for those who don't know, that would be Ramon Rodriguez Verdejo, I think is how you pronounce that, aka Monchi, who was the sporting director at Sevilla, has now moved to Roma. For those who don't really know much more about him, and myself included a little bit, can you explain who he is and why this is worth talking about?
Yeah, so Monchi is he's sort of a lifelong Sevilla fixture as a player, and then I guess it was in 2000 he took over. He sort of took over the team as sporting director, and basically was responsible for starting the careers of some of the players, like sort of mainstay players that we know today. I could give you a laundry list of who he's created, but basically he's sort of created this sort of system of scouting networks and scouting, as a scouting model at Sevilla that has become sort of the envy of Europe and has caught notice of people who sort of look at the price he's paid for certain players to come in and then the fees that they attract in the transfer market on their way out. So that's sort of how he's made his name. And, I think it's he sort of represents the sort of leading edge of the sort of change in football from, the manager sort of being the most famous sort of single non-playing staff at a club. And I think that there's a sense that there's a shift toward recognizing sporting directors. Mm-hmm. And obviously they have, I think Monchi was at Sevilla for like 16 or 17 years. So they tend to have a longer staying power than the guys at the bench. So that may be one reason why we don't notice them as much. But it's also because traditionally the work, that we see them do is kind of, we consider it boring. It's like doing deals with agents, going to other clubs, talking with presidents and executives. And we don't see it as exciting, but I think maybe because of the mentality of, the popularity of games like Football Manager and mm-hmm. The general nerdification of soccer, I think people are paying more and more attention to the guys in the back room. And this is a guy who's brought in so many players like Dani Alves, Julio Baptista, I think Sergio Ramos, mm-hmm. Jesus Navas, it just goes on and on. These are guys who basically key figures in the Spanish national team, guys who earn, millions of euros and pounds today. So that was no small feat. That's sort of what made him a superstar, and I think that's what caught Jim Pilata's attention
mm-hmm.
at Roma.
So a big part of that you mentioned there is he brings in these names either through the youth system or by this elaborate scouting network he has that allows him to identify young talents, buy them relatively inexpensively, and then here's the issue is kind of selling them on, right? And so Sevilla do have the success. They won 3 Europa Leagues in a row. That's, not too shabby. But by the same token, It's not as though he is winning the Champions League regularly, winning La Liga regularly. And I think that's because of the model of Sevilla, that they are very much a selling club. Do you think that will change with Roma? Do you think it will still be somewhat similar to Sevilla, where he will be selling on some of those players? Or do you think Roma will have more of an emphasis on keeping that talent and really challenging for Serie A supremacy?
That's a really good question. I think my sense of Jim Pilata, just in terms of hearing him speak and just knowing some of the people he's hired, they got Luke Bourne, who's now just the sort of analytics superstar who went to the NBA. And my sense listening to him speak is that I think I heard him at Sloan last year, and he was talking about, just the stupid money that is spent in European football. And, when he talks about it, he's not talking about it enthusiastically. I think his idea is that, there's a lot of money that's spent probably wastefully, and certainly by the bigger clubs, maybe they don't have as much of a choice involved in it. But I think his Monchi's role at Roma will be pretty similar to Sevilla. I don't think that there'll be a radical shift in terms of keeping players. I think there'll be a recognition that obviously Serie A is not exactly like La Liga, as much as Juventus has a stranglehold on the top of the table at the moment. I think there's a sense that if Roma are just do things intelligently for the next 5-7 seasons, that they could definitely win a Scudetto off an off season from Juventus, or a transitional season from Juventus and the team they have now. So I think Pilata's just understanding that Roma has the potential to be a sort of, a bigger fish in a relatively medium-sized pond. So, and I think that, that can have a knock-on effect for how they do in Europe as well. So, and obviously, Sevilla aren't winning the Champions League, but, winning the Europa League is not exactly easy either. So I think, putting a team that's competitive in Europe at all is a good thing. So, I don't imagine the mandate will be radically different, but it'll be interesting to see, and I think, and I sort of joked on Twitter, it'll be 3 years before we see the fruits of what he's able to do. But I really think that there's probably a lot of front labor. I mean, he did an interview on the Roma website where he's talking about, they just need little changes. Like Roma do everything right, but they just need little changes. And I suspect that might be him being diplomatic. He'll probably want things slightly more his way.
Yeah.
So that's, and then the other challenge is obviously, Monchi's been at Sevilla his entire life, and he's had a huge, over a decade of influence on the team, and that's a little different when you're walking into a different organization that may have completely different values that are alien to the way that you're used to doing things. So I think that'll be the other challenge he'll have to face there.
And you are just anticipating my questions. I'm just like crossing them off as you go through them, because I was going to ask you that I think he's been in like that director role for like roughly 17 years or in some form or the other. And then he's been at Sevilla for like 30 years, I think, because I think as a player as well. So he's been there for a long time. Yeah. And I did wonder if he does want things his way going to Roma, how much of a risk there is of like trying to force things too quickly. Because Sevilla, you've got the longevity, you can kind of slowly roll things out, and there's less pressure. Whereas I feel like Roma, you're this name coming in, people have expectations. Like I've seen people already writing articles about how this could change, the entire dynamic in Italy, and Roma are suddenly a contender. And I don't think that's necessarily fair, but I could see that pressure on him right away, and him having this kind of desire to change things quickly to really have an impact and make it clear that he's in charge. Do you think that that's a concern, or do you think he's smarter than that?
Well, I don't know. I don't know him personally. I mean, maybe he'll freak out and feel the pressure. But, it's like anytime when a football club hires like an analytics guy, it's like they're instantly all powerful. And so every mistake that's made in recruitment is because of them, right? And so I think, unfortunately, the other side of fame is heightened scrutiny, but also, the press who often doesn't know much about what's going on within a club walls, will just start making assumptions and put pressure on owners for hiring this and that person. And unfortunately, obviously, if Roma have an off season in recruitment, then Monchi could obviously feel the pressure. But I imagine that pressure will probably be domestic. And there's sometimes bigger fish to fry in Serie A anyway. And so there's not a shortage of irresponsibly run clubs that will obviously make Roma look much better in comparison. So I think there'll be difficulties there, but I don't imagine that Monchi would feel, and I think the way that Jim Pilata thinks as well, and he's not exactly a guy to kowtow to pressure on how to run things. And certainly if he had been, he would have cut loose by now, and he hasn't. So I don't imagine that his mandate will be, we need to change overnight. So I think they'll definitely try to play the long game, and I think he probably wouldn't have made the move otherwise.
Yeah.
But we'll see what happens.
So to talk about like the situation at Roma a little bit in more detail. So you've got Pilata there. Obviously, he is a fan of Monchi. Otherwise, he would not have paid him the, I'm assuming, lucrative contract that he is paying him. But you've also got Luciano Spalletti there as the manager of Roma. And I think for a lot of people, be they new to the game or having watched for a long time, it sometimes can be like, I think there's an assumption that the manager is the one who's in charge of who's coming in and who's going, what players are going to be purchased. And I think there's this idea that Jose Mourinho says, I need these 4 players and then we'll win. And then the club goes out and buys those players. Obviously, it's a little more nuanced than that. And the sporting director tends to have a lot of control or all the control in that. So how do you think Luciano Spalletti reacts to this move? Do you think he's pleased with it, or do you think it means a little bit loss of authority for him?
Well, I mean, my sense of Monchi is that he's not a guy, traditionally he's actually not really a guy who steps on managerial toes. Mm-hmm. And I think, but again, the problem was at Sevilla, he was seen as, as much as he was sporting director, he's almost like a de facto executive in a way. So I think, I think managers coming in knew that what they were coming into. So I don't think there was a huge management of egos. And I think generally he liked the managers that he worked with. At least that was my impression, having read interviews with him, is that he tries to complement his managers where possible. So you won't read about a ton of friction, with whom he's had to work with in terms of the bench. So I don't imagine Spalletti will freak out. But even if he does, I mean, there's no shortage of people who would be willing to come to Roma to work with.
Yeah.
With, the kind of, yeah, because I mean, Monchi's, I've definitely heard him say that he's a strong believer in the autonomy of managers to make decisions and have preferences in sorts of tactics, and working within those preferences to build the best team possible. So I think in some ways you could see Spalletti will hopefully see a kindred spirit in the director. So that's another reason to be tentatively positive about that.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, it's not as though Luciano Spalletti has been fired by Roma before. Oh wait, yes he has.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe he's aware of his own career mortality there.
Well, that's how Serie A is anyway, right? Like it's just,
yeah.
The guys on the bench know that literally, 3 bad results will you can change a manager 2 times in 1 month in that league. Obviously, Roma doing that would raise eyebrows, and Spalletti, obviously, he's been there before, so it's I think that would raise some controversy. But you're absolutely right. I don't think he's gonna freak out.
Is this also where we say cough cough looking in your direction, Inter Milan? Because what are they on, like their 12th manager this season, I think? Something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just like, that's the thing. I mean, that's the other wonderful thing about Serie A is like you get any sort of interesting move toward some sort of measure of stability, and you're going to look good, again, by comparison, regardless of where you finish in the league table. Any modicum of stability, whether it's ownership or the managerial level is a good thing. So again, I think that will give him some breathing room to do what he wants and to take the time that he needs to put the system he prefers in place.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'm assuming a large component of his ability to succeed at Roma will be his ability to maybe bring in the people he worked with at Sevilla or worked for him at Sevilla, more appropriately. It seems like he left that club on good terms. They had the Ring of Honor where he got the standing ovation and was able to say goodbye. Do you think the club will let some of the people he has employed go with him? Or, I mean, how much trepidation is there, do you think, on the part of Sevilla to hold on to that scouting network that he's established?
That's a really good question. Actually, not necessarily in terms of, I don't know who he'd want to take with him, but at least in terms of his view, because this is something I was curious about, is like, one of the things you always notice is like if a team has a system that worked and it was developed under a single person, in terms of media coverage, the instinct is always to say, well, this person, they have this magical power, that they've done these indelible qualities that you can't sort of recreate in another club. And I actually, I remember reading that Monchi was actually saying, his view is that he himself did not represent, the system that he worked to put in place at Sevilla, and that he believed that it would continue or should continue in his absence, right? And I think the whole name of the game in terms of what he sort of established there, it's not just that he had this scouting network and this sort of system of, 16 people watching leagues all around the world and building these starting 11 teams, which is not the hardest thing to recreate or the hardest thing to sustain. It's not that as much as the idea of long-term planning and thinking about longevity that sort of sets Sevilla apart. And that's not something that necessarily needs a guy like Monchi to stay. It's the same when Nicola Cortese left Southampton and everyone assumed the project would collapse in on itself. And then they even changed owners, and yet lo and behold, Southampton in many ways are still, obviously Les Reed is still there. So that's another area of continuity. But the whole point is that it's not supposed to be about any one person. So, if Monchi leaves and, even if he takes a step with him, if Sevilla collapses, and in some ways Monchi's model was kind of a failure because, it entirely relied on his presence, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's not what he brings. Ideally, that's not what he really is supposed to bring to a club like Roma.
See, these are the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show, Richard. It's like the nuanced, reasoned opinion as opposed to my it could be a problem. Who knows? Thanks for that.
Well, no, it's a good thing to think about, right? But I think that's what makes the sporting director role really interesting. Is it's not about, ideally it's not supposed to be about, hey, I'm the wheeler and dealer, I'm a good. And the thing is that, as much as I say that, Monchi is a good negotiator. He's really good with agents. And a lot of what it comes down to is not just about having the scouting network. It's about when you're in the room and you realize an agent has come to you with a player that you've not necessarily looked at as your first choice. Well, do you take that player, or do you say no? We have this list, and or if you go and you want a player and that deal collapses and you have a second choice option, how do you decide on that second choice? Those aren't small questions, and a lot of that involves the negotiating power of the actual human being involved. So in some sense, that is what Monchi brings to the table. But whether or not that's entirely what he developed at Sevilla is uncertain. But I would hope and suspect that it is not, so that he's left something there of a legacy.
Well, I'm going to say you let me transition with this one because you mentioned legacy. And the big news today, I would say, like away from the soccer pitch, has been I'm going to say upheaval at ESPN and kind of, I'm going to say the legacy of that organization, maybe a little bit tainted just by the changes that seem to be happening today. I know you tweeted about that as well, and I wanted to see if you had some thoughts on kind of what's going on with ESPN and why this seems to be happening, that over 100 employees are being let go as of today?
Yeah, so I think, the first things first is that as someone who's been laid off by a media organization, it sucks and it's life-changing, but it's never like the end of the road, right? Mm-hmm. By hook or crook, I'm still here, and so are a lot of people who've been in similar situations. So I think the idea that sports media is somehow going to disappear as a career is probably a little overblown. That said, I think, someone, I think it was Zito Madu tweeted, that Fox Sports 1 is going through the same issues, and I think it's just a transition that people sort of thought wouldn't happen, but that is affecting, sports networks as well. It's just that people are, moving more and more away from TV. That they're just not watching, the 24-hour sports stations, and I think it's affecting ESPN's bottom line, whether or not their decision to fire all these really embedded writers. I mean, they fired a baseball writer with like 500,000 Twitter followers who clearly had a ton of influence. So I don't know whether that's the best strategy, but I think that's obviously they're looking at ways to trim the fat because I think they're freaking out about what's the sort of the trend in TV coverage. So our TV ratings. So yeah, I think it's unfortunately going to be something we're going to be seeing more and more. And fundamentally it's a visual medium, and it's great that it was this network of amazing writers they've had for so long. But I guess it was always going to sort of contract. But it's just really unfortunate because it's not like these guys have an immediate. It's not like there's bountiful jobs for these people to waltz into right now. So
yeah, it also sounds like some of them knew it was coming, and then some were kind of blindsided by it. Because as you mentioned, there's guys with lots of followers. There's like Ed. Now, I want to say Woodward. I forget his name. Ed Werder, I think it is, like the ESPN analyst who's been there forever. So it was surprising to me to see that it was kind of all sports that were impacted. It wasn't just like, I know they gutted their hockey coverage, but it seems like it's been sort of across the board. We're trimming down to maybe go digital. Do you think there's truth in that? Because that seems to have been maybe the corporate narrative, is that we're trimming down, there's cord cutting, we're going to try to put more digital content out there, and that's going to be more of our focus for the future.
Yeah, the thing is, a couple of things. Like we never, I know I saw that the president released this sort of statement, and there's always a lot of smoke and mirrors, and there's always another story that, there's not always necessarily a grand arcing strategy to these things. Sometimes there's just like we need to, we got to trim the fat here, or we're not making our bottom line. This is a bad quarter, whatever, and a decision has to be taken. So who knows? I don't know exactly what their long-term strategy is, and I'm certain we'll find out over time. But yeah, I don't really know. I don't know what the thinking was, and this comes after a lot of decisions that weren't really great for the written word, and involving obviously the tanking of Grantland, which like kind of cratered a pretty major area or source of quality sports writing, and. So I don't know. I don't know what the future is, but I don't know, the sort of other giant sports related corporation that's going to come in and hoover these people up and give them a platform. So that's kind of the scary thing.
Well, I know that if any of them want to start writing about soccer, they can just email you their pitches, right? I know you don't get many solicitations for pitches on a daily basis, so maybe you need some more of those.
Oh yeah, not at all. Yeah, definitely. Well, I will say. I may have reached out to at least one or two people I know and like, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, it's always good opportunity for editors, but always not great for writers, because that's always the thing about those staff writing jobs. You want them, you love them, but you also know that you could get that nasty phone call literally at any moment. So it's a career, kids. Don't get involved. Yeah.
Well, on that note, if people want to hear more from you, read more from you, where can they find that, Richard?
They can find it at our Whittall or just Google Richard Whittall. You can get the spelling wrong if you want. You'll probably still find me. Whittall. I'm on the internet. You'll find me.
And editing at Paste Soccer, and then every now and then writing some stuff. What was the last thing you wrote or published on Paste?
Oh God, I think it was on Toronto FC. I've been trying to cover them this year, but I was sick for a couple games, so I'm like the worst beat writer, but I'm planning to get back into the action in May. It doesn't matter. You could literally miss 3 months in MLS, and you dive right back in, and there would be no difference in the table. So that's one of the nice things about the league. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, Richard, thank you very much for taking the time. I very much appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners do as well.
All right, great. Thanks for talking to me.